a murder so perfect it raised no suspicion at all. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Share your location below. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Your voice matters into the case. The drive to Kensington was a silent one, save for the muffled clatter of wheels upon the wet stones and the occasional sharp observation from Holmes, who seemed less inclined to conversation than to that inward absorption which marked the beginning of his most serious labours. He sat opposite me in the cab, his long, nervous fingers pressed together, his eyes half closed beneath the brim of his travelling hat. To a stranger he might have appeared drowsy. To me, who knew him better, he was at the very height of alertness. "You are turning over the argument in your mind," said I at last. "The argument, the note, the locked door." "Ah, and our client's instinct," Holmes replied. "Never wholly neglect instinct, Watson, when it comes from one who has lived in close intimacy with the facts. It is often only reason in its earliest and least articulate form." "You think Sir Reginald's doubt may rest upon something he has not consciously observed?" "Precisely. A man says, 'I feel that this thing is wrong,' when what he means is that a dozen tiny impressions, individually too slight for notice, have already summed themselves in his mind. It is our business to separate and name them." The Markham residence stood in a grave and well-ordered square, one of those large London houses whose sober dignity seems to conceal, rather than display, the fortunes of their owners. A footman admitted us with the subdued manner proper to a house of recent death, and we were shown at once to the morning room, where Sir Reginald awaited us beside the fire. He had recovered some part of his composure, but his features still bore the strain of a sleepless night. After a few words of courtesy, Holmes declined refreshment and asked, with that crisp directness which he could assume when the matter was urgent, to be taken first to the study in which the tragedy had occurred. The room lay at the back of the house upon the ground floor, overlooking a narrow strip of garden hemmed in by a high brick wall. It was a handsome chamber, lined with books, with a broad writing desk near the hearth and a heavy Turkey carpet deadening the tread. The curtains were half drawn against the dreary light of the morning. Eyes and the atmosphere retained that curious oppressive stillness which lingers in places where violent death has recently intruded. Inspector Lestrade was already there. He stood with his back to the empty grate, trim, active, and self-assured, holding his gloves in one hand and greeting Holmes with a smile that was half amusement and half challenge. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he, "I was told we might expect you, though I fear there is little left for even you to discover. A sad business, but plain enough." Holmes removed his coat without haste and cast his keen glance about the chamber. "That is what makes it interesting," said he. Lestrade shrugged. "A gentleman, alone in his room, writes a confession, locks the door, and shoots himself. If that is not plain, I should be glad to know what is." "It is often the plain things," Holmes returned, which demand the closest inspection." The inspector, who was accustomed to these thrusts, merely pursed his lips and turned to Sir Reginald. "I have kept the room as nearly as possible in the condition in which it was found," said our client. "Nothing has been altered beyond what necessity required." Holmes nodded and began his examination with a minuteness that would have seemed absurd to anyone unfamiliar with his methods. He first approached the door, testing the lock, then knelt to inspect the key still inserted on the inner side. He opened and shut the door twice, noting the play of the latch, then crossed to the French window, whose shutters were barred within. After that he turned his attention to the desk. I had by then seen enough of Holmes's investigations to resist the temptation of interrupting him with premature questions. I therefore contented myself with observing what I could. Upon the desk lay several papers neatly arranged, an inkstand, a silver letter opener, and a green-shaded reading lamp. Beside these objects there remained a vacant space, and I guessed that it had been there the fatal note was found. A chair had been pushed slightly back as though its occupant had risen abruptly or half-risen before sinking again. On the carpet, not far from the chair leg, I perceived a dark stain which no scrubbing could wholly remove. "The body was found here?" asked Holmes. "Exactly there," said Lestrade, indicating the spot with a motion of his glove. Seated sideways from the desk, the revolver in his right hand, one shot to the temple, death instantaneous, Holmes held out his hand. The revolver. Lestrade produced it from a side table where, I imagine, it had been left for official purposes. Holmes weighed it lightly, examined the chambers, and brought it close to his nose. "Recently discharged, of course," said Lestrade. "There were no other prints of value." "No other prints?" Holmes repeated. "None that signify. The dead man's own were sufficient." Holmes set the weapon down and turned suddenly to Sir Reginald. "You mentioned an argument. Who heard it?" "The butler, Ames, and one of the housemaids. They were in the passage. They heard my brother speaking in a raised voice, as though to another person. They could not distinguish every word, but they are certain he was not alone." Lestrade lifted his brows. "Or else he was speaking to himself, which is by no means unknown in a man bent upon self-destruction." Sir Reginald flushed. "My brother was not mad." "Our inspector." "I did not say mad. Agitated men have queer habits." Holmes had seated himself now in Edward Markham's chair. His eyes travelled from the desk to the hearthrug, then to the shelves, then up to the bell-pull near the mantel. "Was the bell rung at any point?" he asked. "No," said Sir Reginald. "And who forced the door?" "I did," said Sir Reginald. "When the shot was heard, Ames and I came at once. The door was locked, and after repeated calls received no answer. We broke it in together." "With what?" "A coal scuttle from the hall." Holmes rose again and examined the damaged woodwork about the lock. Then he moved to the hearth, where he crouched for so long that even Lestrade began to watch him more closely. At last he picked something from the fender with the tips of his fingers and held it up to the light. It was so tiny that I could scarcely make it out. "Well?" said Lestrade. Holmes slipped the object into his waistcoat pocket. "Well," said he blandly, "it is always unwise to leave one's hearth unswept." The inspector gave a short laugh. "You have found a speck of ash. Shall I arrest the grate?" Holmes did not answer. He had gone instead to the writing desk and was now studying the blotting pad with extraordinary care. He lifted the top sheet, bent it toward the window, and a change, slight but unmistakable, passed over his face. "What is it?" I asked, before I could check myself. He replaced the pad at once. "A most instructive silence," said he. Lestrade frowned. "Come, Mr. Holmes, if you see something bearing upon the case, it might assist us all if you spoke plainly." "My dear Lestrade," said Holmes, "if I spoke plainly at the beginning, where would be the pleasure of your enlightenment at the end?" And with that insufferable answer, which I confess irritated me scarcely less than it did the inspector, he turned to Sir Reginald and requested that the household be assembled, for he had now reached the point, as he put it, at which the dead room must give place to the living witnesses. Sir Reginald rang at once, and within a few minutes the principal servants of the house were gathered in the adjoining morning-room. Holmes, having first cast one last lingering glance about the study, followed us there with an air of quiet anticipation. The group assembled before us consisted of 4 persons: the butler, Ames, a tall, spare man of grave countenance, a middle-aged housekeeper whose anxious eyes seldom left Sir Reginald, a young maid, pale and visibly shaken, and lastly, a footman who appeared more curious than distressed. Each bore in differing degrees the strain of the previous night's events. Holmes took up a position near the window where the weak daylight fell across their faces and regarded them one by one with that singular penetrating gaze which seemed to strip away all pretense. "You will oblige me," said he in his calm, even tone, "by answering my questions with precision. I have no desire to trouble you unnecessarily, but accuracy is essential." His eyes settled upon the butler. "You are Ames?" "Yes, sir." "You were among the first to hear the disturbance?" "I was, sir. I was in the passage outside the study, attending to some correspondence for Sir Reginald." "And you heard voices?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Edward's voice raised more than usual. "More than usual," Holmes repeated. So the butler hesitated slightly. "Mr. Edward was not prone to agitation, sir. He was generally reserved." "And yet last evening he was not?" "No, sir. He seemed, if I may say so, angered." Holmes inclined his head. "Proceed." "I heard him speaking loudly as though in dispute. I could not catch every word, but I distinctly heard him say, 'You shall not have it.'" Holmes' fingers tapped lightly against the back of a chair. "Indeed? And to whom did he say this?" "I could not tell, sir. I heard no second voice clearly, though I believed there must be one." "You believed?" "There was a murmur, sir, low, not distinct enough to make out words." Holmes glanced briefly at me, and I saw in his eyes that this detail had already taken firm hold of his mind. "At what time did this occur?" "Shortly after 9 o'clock, sir." "And the shot?" "Within a few minutes of the voices ceasing." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. You may remain." He turned now to the young maid whose hands trembled visibly. "You also heard the voices?" "Yes, sir," she said faintly. "From where?" "I was in the back corridor, sir, near the kitchen stairs." "And what did you hear?" "Mr. Edward, sir, very loud. I was frightened, for I had never heard him speak so. I thought perhaps he was ill." "Did you hear anyone reply?" She shook her head. "No, sir, only him." Holmes's brows drew together very slightly. "You are certain of that?" "Yes, sir." Holmes dismissed her gently and addressed the housekeeper, but her account added little. She had heard only the shot and the subsequent alarm. The footman, likewise, had nothing of consequence to contribute. When the questioning concluded, but Holmes thanked them all with grave courtesy and requested that they be excused. As the door closed behind them, Lestrade gave a short, satisfied nod. "There you see," said he, "a man alone speaking aloud in agitation, then taking his own life. It is precisely as I have maintained." Holmes did not answer at once. He had returned to the window and stood looking out upon the grey garden, his hands clasped behind his back. "Watson," said he suddenly, "what do you make of it?" "I confess," I replied, "that the absence of a second voice seems significant. If there were another person present, one would expect some clearer evidence of it." "Just so," said Holmes. "And yet we have a statement, 'You shall not have it,' which implies the presence of another party." Lestrade shrugged. A figure of speech, a man arguing with himself, or perhaps recalling some past dispute. Holmes turned. "My dear Lestrade, a man on the verge of suicide does not rehearse polite abstractions. His mind is either fixed upon the act or overwhelmed by it. He does not engage in imaginary negotiations." "Then how do you explain it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That is precisely what we are here to discover." He crossed the room and addressed Sir Reginald once more. "I should like to know," said he, "whether your brother had any visitors yesterday evening." "None that I am aware of," Sir Reginald replied. "He dined with me at 7. He appeared somewhat preoccupied, but not distressed."
After dinner, he retired to his study, as was his habit. And no one called? No one. No letters received? Only the usual correspondence. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You are certain? Sir Reginald hesitated.
And there was, now that you mention it, a single letter delivered shortly before dinner. I did not see it, but Ames informed me of it. Holmes's eyes flickered. Ames, he called. The butler re-entered promptly. The letter delivered yesterday evening, said Holmes, or what became of it? I placed it upon Mr. Edwards' desk, sir. Did you observe anything unusual about it? No, sir, it appeared to be an ordinary letter. Was it opened in your presence? No, sir. Holmes dismissed him once more, and for a moment there was silence. A letter, said Holmes softly. And yet we have seen no such letter among the papers in the study. Lestrade frowned. It may have been destroyed. Perhaps, Holmes replied. But then we must ask why. He moved abruptly toward the door. I should like to see the garden. We followed him out through the French window, which Sir Reginald unlocked at his request. The air outside was cold and heavy with moisture, the grass darkened by the night's rain. The garden itself was narrow, bordered by the high wall I had earlier observed, with a single gravel path running its length. Holmes stepped out and paused, his eyes sweeping the ground with swift precision. He moved along the path, then turned back, examining the base of the wall, the window, and the soft earth near the sill. Nothing, said Lestrade, who had joined us with evident impatience. No footprints, no disturbance. The rain has seen to that, if there were any. Holmes knelt suddenly beside the wall and touched the damp soil. Yes, said he, almost to himself. Oh, the rain has been most obliging. He rose and dusted his hands. Watson, you will observe that the ground here is uniformly soft. Certainly. And yet there is no sign of any impression nearer the window than elsewhere. That is true. Holmes turned to Lestrade. If a man had approached this window from the garden before the rain ceased in the early hours, what would we expect to find? Footprints, said Lestrade. Precisely. And yet there are none. Which proves, said Lestrade triumphantly, that no one came this way. Holmes regarded him with a curious expression. Or, said he quietly, that no one needed to. He turned back toward the house, his face once more composed, though I could see that his mind was now working with increased intensity. The door was locked, he murmured. The window undisturbed. The voices heard, I yet only one distinctly perceived, a letter received and vanished. And upon the blotting pad, he broke off. Come, Watson, said he briskly. There is still one witness who has not yet been properly examined. Who is that? I asked. Holmes's lips curved slightly. The dead man himself. I confess that Holmes's remark struck me with a certain chill, though I was by now well accustomed to his habit of attributing testimony to the inanimate, or, as in this instance, the silent dead. Sir Reginald too started slightly, but said nothing, and led us at once toward the staircase. My brother's body has been taken to his room upstairs, said he in his subdued voice. The doctor has already made his examination. Excellent, murmured Holmes. Or we shall see whether the doctor has observed what he ought. The chamber to which we were shown was one of modest comfort, overlooking the square. The curtains had been drawn wide to admit what little light the day afforded, and upon the bed lay the still form of Edward Markham, covered to the chest with a white sheet. Holmes approached without hesitation. There was in his manner no trace of irreverence, but rather that grave and focused attention which a scientist might bestow upon a delicate specimen. You will permit me, he said quietly. Sir Reginald inclined his head. Holmes drew back the sheet just enough to expose the head and upper torso. The face of the deceased was pale, composed, and strangely free from distortion. The eyes were closed, the lips relaxed, so much so that but for the dreadful wound at the temple, one might have taken him for a man peacefully asleep. Holmes bent close. He examined the wound with meticulous care, then took the dead man's right hand and turned it gently. "Watson," said he, "you will kindly observe." I stepped forward. Holmes indicated the fingers. "The hand which held the revolver," said he. "Yes," I replied. "And what do you notice?" I looked more closely. There was a faint darkening about the fingers and thumb, though less pronounced than I might have expected. "There is some staining," I said, "but it appears slight." "Just so." Holmes released the hand and straightened. "The revolver was discharged at close range," he continued. "We may therefore expect a certain degree of powder marking, not only upon the skin, but upon the hand that held it." "Yet you find it insufficient?" I asked. But Holmes gave a small nod. "Insufficient and uneven. The distribution is not what one would anticipate from a self-inflicted shot." Lestrade, who had followed us in, gave a short exclamation. "Come now, Mr. Holmes, the man shot himself. What more do you require? A demonstration?" Holmes did not so much as glance at him. "I require," said he, "that the physical evidence should agree with the narrative. At present, it does not do so entirely." He turned again to the body and examined the sleeve of the deceased's coat, then the collar, and finally the left hand. "Curious," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes hesitated for a fraction of a second. "A small point, Watson. Perhaps nothing, and yet—" He paused. "No, I shall reserve it for the moment." Lestrade snorted softly. "You are fond of reserving things, Mr. Holmes." "It prevents them from being wasted," Holmes replied mildly. He drew the sheet back into place and stepped away. "I should like to see the clothing worn by Mr. Markham last evening," he said. Sir Reginald rang for Ames, who soon returned with a neatly folded suit. Holmes laid the garments upon a chair and began to examine them one by one. He paid particular attention to the cuffs and pockets, and it was while inspecting the waistcoat that he gave a sudden, quiet exclamation. "Ah!" "What have you found?" I asked eagerly. Holmes held up a small fragment between his fingers, a narrow strip of paper torn irregularly along one edge. "Part of a letter," said he. Lestrade stepped forward. "Then where is the rest of it?" "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the question." He turned the fragment toward the light, and there were a few words visible, no more than 3 or 4, but Holmes' eyes rested upon them with singular intensity. "You shall not," he read softly. "Most instructive." Sir Reginald leaned closer. "That is what Ames heard my brother say." "Indeed," said Holmes, "which suggests that the contents of the missing letter and the spoken words are intimately connected." Lestrade folded his arms. "Or that the man read the letter, became agitated, spoke aloud, and then shot himself. It fits perfectly." Holmes looked at him with an expression that was almost one of pity. "My dear Lestrade," said he, "it fits too perfectly." He slipped the fragment into his pocket. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, had your brother any particular business concerns? Any disputes, financial or otherwise?" Sir Reginald hesitated.
See, Edward managed certain investments for the family. There were occasional disagreements, but nothing of a serious nature. No enemies? None that I know of. Holmes turned to me. "And yet," said he, "we have a man who receives a letter, enters into a heated exchange, whether with another or with the contents of that letter, utters a phrase of refusal, and is shortly thereafter found dead under circumstances which, while superficially conclusive, contain several inconsistencies." He began to pace slowly across the room. The missing letter, the imperfect powder marks, the indistinct second voice, the locked room which may not be so final as it appears. Lestrade shook his head. "You are building castles, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stopped. "No," said he quietly.
"I know I'm removing them." There was something in his tone that caused even the inspector to fall silent. Holmes turned back to Sir Reginald. "I should like to know," he said, "whether your brother was left-handed." "Left-handed?" Sir Reginald repeated in surprise. "No, certainly not. He was right-handed, as I am." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Just so." He exchanged a brief glance with me, and I saw that his thoughts had now advanced considerably, though he still withheld their full expression. "Watson," said he, "you will recall the blotting pad?" "Yes." "There are impressions upon it, faint, but legible enough to one who takes the trouble to look. They correspond to a letter written immediately prior to the note we were shown." "The suicide note?" "Precisely. And yet the sequence of writing is irregular." "In what way?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The confession, my dear Watson, may not be the final document composed in that room, but the last one intended to be seen." I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. I mean, said Holmes, "that our dead man may have been compelled to write it." Lestrade gave a sharp laugh, though there was less confidence in it than before. "Compelled? In a locked room?" Holmes turned toward the door. "Yes," said he softly, "in a locked room." And as he spoke, I could not help but feel that the very certainty upon which the case had been built was beginning, piece by piece, to dissolve beneath his hand. The effect of Holmes's last remark lingered in the room long after the words themselves had faded. Sir Reginald stood as though rooted to the carpet, while Lestrade, though outwardly composed, had lost something of his earlier certainty. As for myself, I found my thoughts racing to reconcile the impossible, compulsion, and yet no visible intruder, a sealed room, and yet evidence of interference. Holmes, however, appeared neither troubled nor hurried. On the contrary, there was about him that peculiar quietude which I had come to associate with the moment when the scattered threads of a case begin to draw themselves together. "Sir Reginald," said he at last, "I must trouble you with a few additional questions regarding your brother's habits." "Anything, Mr. Holmes." "Your brother's correspondence. Was it private, or did it pass through the hands of your servants?" "Private, for the most part. Letters were delivered to him unopened." "And did he retain them?" "Some, yes. Others he destroyed." Holmes nodded. "Was he in the habit of using sealing wax?" Sir Reginald appeared surprised. "No, he generally tore his letters open." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me, but offered no explanation. "And last evening," he continued, "did you observe anything unusual in his manner beyond what you have already described?" Sir Reginald reflected. He seemed distracted. Once or twice he appeared about to speak, but checked himself. I attributed it to business concerns. "Did he leave the table before you?" "Yes." "Shortly after 9. And you saw him no more until after the shot?" "That is correct." Holmes inclined his head and turned away, as though the matter were of no further consequence. Yet I knew well that each answer had been carefully weighed and fitted into some larger design. "Come, Watson," said he quietly.
We shall return to the study." Lestrade followed us with evident reluctance, though curiosity now clearly held him. Once within the room, Holmes closed the door behind us and stood for a moment in silence. "You will observe," said he, "that we are now alone." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Quite alone, Mr. Holmes? As Mr. Markham was?" Holmes smiled faintly. Let us see. He crossed at once to the writing desk and again took up the blotting pad. This time he removed not only the upper sheet but several beneath it, exposing the impressions more fully. He held the surface at an angle to the light, then beckoned me. "Pray look, Watson." I did so, and though the marks were faint, I could distinguish the ghostly outline of words pressed into the paper. "I can make out portions of a sentence," I said. You shall not. It is not yours. The rest is indistinct." "Excellent," said Holmes. "Now compare the pressure of these words with that of the suicide note." I took up the note and examined it closely. "The writing here is firmer," I said. "More deliberate." "Just so. The note was written with care, perhaps even with hesitation. The earlier words—" He tapped the blotting pad. "Were written in agitation. The strokes are uneven, the pressure irregular." Lestrade folded his arms. "A man in distress might well write in such a manner." "Indeed he might," said Holmes. "But would he then compose a calm and orderly confession immediately afterward?" The inspector frowned slightly, but did not reply. Holmes replaced the sheets and turned his attention once more to the desk itself. His fingers moved lightly over its surface, pausing here and there as though guided by some invisible map. "Consider," said he, "the sequence of events as it has been presented to us. A man receives a letter. He becomes agitated, speaks aloud, perhaps argues. He then sits, writes a confession, locks his door and shoots himself." "Yes," said Lestrade, "that is precisely the sequence." "And yet," Holmes continued, "we have reason to believe that the agitation followed the reading of the letter, and that the words spoken correspond to its contents. Therefore the letter must have been upon this desk." "Agreed. And yet it is no longer here." "Destroyed," said Lestrade. Holmes shook his head. "If destroyed, where are the remnants? There is no ash in the grate corresponding to paper burned last evening. I have examined it." Lestrade glanced involuntarily toward the hearth.
"You hate then it was taken," he said. "Precisely." There was a brief silence. "Taken," Lestrade repeated. "But by whom? The door was locked." Holmes walked slowly to the door and laid his hand upon the key. "Locked," said he, "but not necessarily secured against all methods of ingress and egress." Lestrade's expression sharpened. "You suggest a trick?" "I suggest a possibility." Holmes turned the key gently, then withdrew it and held it up. "You will observe," said he, "that this is an ordinary key without any special mechanism. It can be turned from within, and once turned, the door cannot be opened from without unless the key is removed or manipulated." "Which it was not," said Lestrade. "We found it exactly so." "Exactly so," Holmes echoed. He replaced the key and stepped back. "Now consider the window," he continued. "Barred within."
"Oh, and no trace of disturbance without. The garden shows no sign of approach." "Then we are back where we began," said Lestrade. "No one entered or left." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Or else," said he softly, "the person in question never needed to enter at all." Lestrade stared at him. "That is nonsense." "Is it?" Holmes replied calmly. "Tell me, what do we know of the position of the body? Seated near the desk, and the revolver in his right hand, and the wound to the temple?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Very well. Let us suppose that Mr. Markham did indeed sit at this desk. Let us suppose further that he wrote the words impressed upon the blotting pad in a state of agitation. At that moment he is alive, alert, and engaged." "Agreed. And yet," Holmes continued,
"Indeed, the final act, the writing of the confession, shows a different character altogether, controlled, measured." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You are suggesting what exactly?" Holmes turned to him fully now. I am suggesting, said he, that between the writing of those two documents, something occurred within this room, something which altered not only the tone of the writing, but the fate of the writer. And what was that? Holmes's gaze moved slowly about the chamber, resting for a moment upon the chair, the desk, and the empty space where the letter should have been. That, said he quietly, is what we must now discover. He moved suddenly toward the bell pull and gave it a sharp tug. A moment later, Ames appeared once more. Ames, said Holmes, I have one final question. When you and Sir Reginald forced this door, what was the position of the chair? The butler blinked. The chair, sir? Yes, this one. Ames looked at it carefully, then shook his head. It was not so far back, sir, he said slowly. It stood closer to the desk, almost touching it. Holmes's lips curved in a thin, satisfied smile. Thank you, said he. As Ames withdrew, Holmes turned to us, and I saw in his face that same quiet certainty which had preceded so many remarkable conclusions. The dead man has spoken, said he. And now, he added, we must learn how he was silenced. Lestrade stared at Holmes with renewed intensity, the earlier levity now entirely gone from his manner. Silenced? He repeated. You speak as though there were another party present, yet we have established— Holmes raised a hand slightly. We have established, said he, how that the appearances suggest solitude. We have not established that solitude existed. He drew the chair gently back toward the desk, restoring it to the position Ames had described. Then he stood behind it, placing his hands lightly upon its back. Observe, Watson, he said. If a man sits here to write, his body is drawn close to the desk, his movements are confined, his attention is directed forward. Yes. And if, at such a moment, he was suddenly confronted, whether by threat or by force, his first instinct would be either to rise or to turn. Holmes gave the chair a slight push backward, which would produce precisely this displacement. Lestrade nodded reluctantly. That is reasonable enough. Holmes continued, Now consider the agitation expressed in the earlier writing, the words overheard by the servants,
and the disappearance of the letter. These all indicate the presence, direct or indirect, of another will acting upon the deceased. But no one was seen to enter, Lestrade insisted. No one needed to be seen, Holmes replied quietly. There was something in his tone that caused me to look at him more closely. His eyes had taken on that distant, abstracted expression which signalled that his mind had advanced further than his words. You have formed a theory, I said. A provisional one, he answered. But before I test it, there is one point still lacking. And that is? Holmes turned once more toward the desk and took up the small fragment of paper he had earlier secured from the waistcoat. The letter, said he. We must reconstruct it, not in its entirety, perhaps.
But sufficiently to understand its purpose. He held the fragment near the blotting pad, aligning the visible words with the impressions. You shall not, he murmured, and here, it is not yours. A refusal, a dispute over possession. Possession of what? I asked. Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he crossed to the bookshelf and began scanning the volumes with rapid precision, as though seeking some object whose absence might speak louder than its presence. Sir Reginald, he called, has anything been removed from this room since last evening? Nothing, came the reply from the doorway, where our client had rejoined us, unable, it seemed, to remain apart from the unfolding inquiry. Holmes turned. You are quite certain? Entirely. Holmes's gaze lingered upon him for a moment, then shifted to the desk once more. And yet, said he softly, something has been taken. Lestrade frowned. The letter, perhaps, but nothing more. Holmes smiled faintly. The letter is but the means, Lestrade, not the object. He moved again toward the hearth and knelt, examining the fender and the tiles beneath it. After a moment, he extended his hand and traced a faint line along the edge of the metal. Watson, said he, pray come here. I joined him, and he indicated a barely perceptible mark, no more than a slight abrasion upon the polished surface. Scratched, I said. Recently, Holmes added, and in a direction inconsistent with ordinary use. Lestrade joined us. What of it? Holmes rose. What of it? He repeated. Everything, perhaps. He stepped back and surveyed the room as a whole, his eyes moving from the desk to the chair, from the hearth to the door, and finally to the bell pull. A man sits here, he said slowly. He reads a letter. He becomes agitated. He writes words of refusal. He is then compelled, by means not yet fully understood, to compose a confession. The letter is removed. The scene is arranged. The door is secured. And yet no one leaves, said Lestrade. Holmes inclined his head. Just so. There was a long pause. Then quite suddenly Holmes's expression changed. A spark, quick, decisive, lit his features. Ah, he said softly. I felt a surge of anticipation. You have it? I asked. Not the whole, he replied, but enough. He turned sharply to Sir Reginald. Your brother's affairs, these investments he managed, were they of a confidential nature? Yes, said Sir Reginald. Highly so. And were there documents, papers of value, kept in this room? Certainly.
In the desk. Holmes crossed at once to the desk and opened one of its drawers. He examined the contents briefly, then closed it again. Locked compartments? He asked. There is one, said Sir Reginald, indicating a concealed panel. Holmes opened it with deft fingers. It was empty. When was this last used? Holmes asked. I cannot say. Holmes closed the panel and turned away, his face now set in lines of quiet determination. Watson, said he, we are dealing with a crime in which the murderer has relied not upon concealment, but upon certainty. Every element has been arranged to produce a single, unavoidable conclusion. Suicide, I said. Precisely. Lestrade gave a short, sharp nod. And a very convincing one. Yes, said Holmes, convincing enough to satisfy the police. Convincing enough, perhaps.
To satisfy the public. He paused. But not convincing enough, he added softly, to satisfy the facts. There was a moment's silence. Then Holmes took up his coat. Sir Reginald, said he, I must ask you to provide me with a list of all persons who had business dealings with your brother, particularly those who might have had cause to dispute with him. I shall do so at once. And one more thing, Holmes continued, no mention of our conclusions is to be made, either to the servants or to any outsider. Of course. Holmes turned to Lestrade. My dear Inspector, I trust you will allow the case to remain open. Lestrade hesitated, then gave a reluctant shrug. I cannot close it if you insist on stirring it up, said he. But I warn you, Holmes, you are chasing shadows. Holmes smiled. No, said he.
I am following footprints. But there are none, Lestrade protested. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Exactly, said he. He moved toward the door, and I followed, my mind alive with questions. As we stepped once more into the dim corridor, I could not restrain myself. Holmes, I said, what is it that you have seen? He paused, just for a moment, and glanced back toward the closed study door. A man may be murdered, said he quietly, without his killer ever crossing the threshold. I felt a chill at his words. And how? I asked. Is such a thing accomplished? Holmes turned his collar up against the cold as we made our way toward the front of the house. That, my dear Watson, he said, is what I intend to prove. We had scarcely taken our leave of the Markham residence when Holmes signalled for a cab.
His manner now marked by a quiet urgency which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to decisive action. He gave no immediate explanation, but settled into the seat beside me with his eyes fixed intently upon the passing streets, as though each turn of the wheel brought him nearer to some invisible point of convergence. "You have formed your theory," said I at last. "I have formed," he replied, "a structure, one which stands upon several firm supports, though a central pillar remains to be tested. And that pillar?" Holmes glanced at me. "The means," said he simply. "The means by which the crime was committed." "Precisely. Motive we may infer, opportunity we may question. But means must be demonstrated." "And you believe it was accomplished without the murderer entering the room?" "I do." I confess I found this assertion difficult to reconcile with the physical facts as I understood them. "But how," I pressed, "can a man be compelled to write, then killed, and yet leave no trace of another's presence?" Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Consider, Watson," said he, "how often we mistake proximity for agency. We assume that because an effect is observed in a given place, its cause must also have been present there. You suggest the cause lay elsewhere? I suggest that the cause may have been set in motion from without, yet completed within." I was about to reply when the cab drew up abruptly. "Where are we?" I asked. "Baker Street," said Holmes. We alighted, and Holmes ascended the familiar steps with a briskness that contrasted sharply with his earlier composure. Once inside, he went at once to his chemical table and began searching among his various instruments and bottles. "Watson," said he, "you will oblige me by fetching the small case of reagents from the drawer beneath the window." I did so, placing it before him. Holmes opened it and selected a vial which he held up to the light. "Tell me," said he, "what is the effect of certain vapours upon the human nervous system?" "That depends entirely upon the substance," I replied. "Some may induce unconsciousness, others hallucination, paralysis, or even death." "Quite so. And is it possible for such vapours to act rapidly?" "In some cases, yes, particularly in confined spaces." Holmes nodded.
And would such an agent necessarily leave obvious traces?" "Not always," I said, "especially if it were volatile." Holmes smiled faintly. "Excellent, Watson. You confirm what I had hoped." He set the vial aside and began pacing the room. "A confined space," he murmured. "A man seated at his desk, a window closed, a door locked, the introduction of an agent, silent, invisible, and swift." "You believe he was poisoned?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Not poisoned in the conventional sense, not administered by hand, nor ingested, rather delivered." "Delivered how?" Holmes stopped and turned toward me. "That," said he, "is the question which must be answered before we may proceed further." He moved to the mantel and took up his pipe, though he did not light it. "Let us review," he continued. We have a man who receives a letter, one which provokes agitation. He speaks aloud, perhaps in response to its contents. He writes words of refusal, then something occurs." "The compulsion," I said. "Yes. He is compelled to write a confession. His tone changes. His writing becomes controlled. The letter disappears. The scene is arranged. And then he is killed." Holmes inclined his head, but not by any ordinary means. There is no sign of struggle, no second person observed, no mark of intrusion. He paused. "And yet
he added. The body tells us that the final act, the discharge of the revolver, was not entirely consistent with voluntary action. The powder marks, I said. Precisely. Holmes resumed his pacing. Now consider the hearth, he said. The fragment I found, the mark upon the fender, these are not random details. They indicate the presence of something small, perhaps, but significant. A device? I suggested. Holmes's eyes flashed. Ah, Watson, you approach the truth. He stopped again, his expression one of intense concentration. A device, he repeated softly. Something placed within the room, perhaps introduced under the guise of something harmless, something capable of acting without direct human intervention. And the letter? I asked. The letter, said Holmes, was the bait. I felt a sudden tightening of the mind, as though disparate pieces were beginning at last to align. You mean that the letter itself was connected to the means of the crime? I do. Holmes moved swiftly now, crossing to his desk and taking up a sheet of paper. Let us suppose, he said, that the letter contained not only words, but something more, something concealed or perhaps attached, something which, once opened or handled, would initiate the sequence we have observed. A mechanism triggered by the act of reading, I said. Or by proximity, Holmes replied. Or by heat, or by contact. The possibilities are numerous, but the principle remains. He turned to me. The murderer did not need to enter the room, Watson, because he had already been there, in effect, through the instrument he employed. And once the act was completed, the evidence removed, the letter taken, the appearance of suicide preserved. Holmes's voice dropped slightly. A crime constructed not to evade suspicion, but to eliminate it entirely. There was a long silence. Then I said, And the culprit? Holmes's gaze grew distant once more. The culprit, said he, Auden is one who knew not only the habits of the deceased, but the limitations of the human mind, one who understood that the most perfect disguise is not concealment, but certainty. He took up his coat again. Come, Watson, he said, we must return to Kensington. Ah, so soon? Yes. There is one final experiment to be made, and if I am correct, it will provide us with the proof we require. And if you are not? Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Then, said he, we shall have learned something. As we once more stepped out into the damp London air, I could not help but feel that we stood upon the very edge of revelation. The case which had begun with such deceptive simplicity had grown into something far more intricate and far more sinister. And yet, for all its complexity, Holmes now pursued it with a clarity that admitted no doubt. The question was no longer whether Edward Markham had been murdered, but how and by whom the perfect illusion of his death had been so carefully devised. When we returned to the Markham residence, the afternoon had deepened into that peculiar London gloom which seems to gather even before the sun has fully set. A fine mist hung in the air, blurring the outlines of the square and lending to the house an aspect of quiet isolation. Sir Reginald received us at once, his anxiety scarcely concealed. You have discovered something? He asked. Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate care. I have discovered enough, said he, to require a further examination, one which I must ask you to permit without interruption. Anything, Mr. Holmes? Holmes turned to Ames. You will ensure that no one enters the study while we are within it. Yes, sir. We proceeded directly to the room once more. Holmes closed the door behind us and stood for a moment, as though reacquainting himself with every detail. Watson, said he quietly, we must reconstruct the final minutes. I nodded. Holmes moved to the desk and seated himself in Edward Markham's chair. "Observe," he said. "I am the deceased. I have received a letter. I open it here." He made the gesture, his fingers miming the act with remarkable precision. I read. I become agitated. I speak aloud. His voice, though controlled, carried a sharp edge. "You shall not have it." He paused, then leaned forward slightly as though writing. I take up my pen. I write in haste, these words impressed upon the blotting pad. He made a few swift motions. I then suddenly stiffened. And then he stopped. The silence that followed was profound. "And then?" I prompted. Holmes rose slowly. "And then," said he, "something intervenes." He walked to the hearth and stood before it, his eyes fixed upon the grate. "Consider this," he continued. "The fragment I found, barely perceptible, yet present, the mark upon the fender, both indicate that something small, perhaps metallic, was placed or moved here." "A device," I said. "Just so." He turned back toward the desk. "But why here? Why the hearth and not the desk itself?" Lestrade, who had joined us once more, gave a slight shrug. "Because you imagine it so." Holmes ignored him. "The hearth is the only point in the room where heat is regularly applied," he said, "a source of ignition, a means by which a mechanism might be activated without human presence." I felt a sudden quickening of interest. "You mean something triggered by fire?" "Or by warmth," Holmes replied. "Yes." He knelt once more and examined the grate with renewed attention. After a moment he reached into the ash and withdrew a minute object, so small that I could scarcely distinguish it. "What is that?" I asked. Holmes held it between thumb and forefinger. "A fragment of wire," said he. "Twisted, perhaps once part of a spring or clasp." Lestrade leaned forward. "That proves nothing." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "it proves that something mechanical was present, and that it was not part of the ordinary furnishings of this room." He rose and crossed to the desk again. "Now let us consider the letter," he said. "It arrives shortly before dinner. It is placed upon the desk. The deceased reads it." "And becomes agitated," I added. "Yes, but not merely agitated, defiant. You shall not have it. It is not yours." These are not the words of despair, but of resistance. Holmes's eyes sharpened. And yet moments later he writes a confession, calm, measured, final. Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You think he was forced?" he said. "I think," Holmes replied, "that he was compelled, not by a visible hand, but by circumstance." He moved again to the hearth. "Suppose," he continued, "that the letter contained within it a small apparatus, something easily concealed. When opened, it is removed, perhaps unknowingly, and placed aside." "Where?" I asked. Holmes gestured toward the fender. "Here."
A natural resting place for any small object taken from the hand, particularly if the reader's attention is fixed upon the contents of the letter. And then? Holmes's voice dropped slightly. "Then the mechanism is activated, by the heat of the fire perhaps, or by some delayed action. It releases a vapor, subtle, potent, and swift." I felt a chill. "The vapor incapacitates him?" "Precisely, not instantly, but sufficiently to weaken his resistance. He remains conscious, perhaps, but disoriented, suggestible, and thus compelled to write the confession," I said slowly. Holmes inclined his head. "Just so." Lestrade gave a sharp exclamation. "But that is conjecture. You have no proof that such a device existed." Holmes turned to him. "No proof?" he said quietly. "We have the fragment of wire. We have the mark upon the fender."
"We have the absence of any other means, and we have the result." He paused. But you are correct in one respect, Lestrade. We must have more than inference. He moved to the window and examined the frame carefully, then turned back. There remains the final act, he said, the shot. Yes, said Lestrade, the man shot himself. Holmes's gaze was steady. Did he? There was a moment's silence. The revolver was in his hand, said Lestrade. And yet, Holmes replied, the powder marks are insufficient and uneven. The position of the chair suggests movement after the writing, and the timing, the shot occurring shortly after the voices ceased, suggests not a deliberate act, but a conclusion. A conclusion to what? I asked. Holmes looked at me. To the process, said he. He stepped closer to the desk. Imagine, he continued, a man weakened or disoriented, perhaps partially paralyzed. He writes as instructed, whether by fear, by confusion, or by suggestion. Then Holmes raised his hand slightly as though holding an invisible object. The final mechanism is triggered. I felt my pulse quicken. You mean the revolver itself? Holmes's eyes gleamed. I mean, Watson, that the revolver may not have been discharged by the will of the man who held it. Lestrade stared. That is impossible. Holmes smiled faintly. Impossible, said he, is a word best reserved for conclusions, not for possibilities. He turned to Sir Reginald. There is one question remaining, he said, one which, if answered, will bring us very near the truth. Sir Reginald stepped forward. What is it? Holmes' gaze was intent. Who? He asked. It is knew your brother well enough to anticipate his actions, his habits, his very thoughts, and who stood to gain by removing him. Sir Reginald hesitated. There are several who had dealings with him. Holmes nodded. Then we must examine them all. He took up his coat once more. For I think, he added quietly, that the hand which never entered this room has already left its mark elsewhere. And with that, the investigation, until now confined to the silent testimony of a single chamber, began to extend outward, toward the living world where motive and opportunity would at last take shape. Sir Reginald did not immediately reply. He moved slowly toward the fireplace, resting one hand upon the mantel, as though steadying himself against the weight of Holmes's question. My brother's affairs, said he at last, were extensive. There were partners, clients, and, on occasion, adversaries, but none, I should think, capable of such contrivance. Holmes regarded him steadily. Capability, said he, is often less visible than motive. Let us begin with the latter. Sir Reginald inclined his head. There is one man, he said slowly, a Mr. Julian Faversham. He had dealings with Edward, financial ones, and they did not part on the best of terms. Holmes' eyes flickered with interest. In what way? There was a dispute over certain securities. Edward refused to release them, claiming irregularities. Faversham was insistent. Insistent enough to threaten? Sir Reginald hesitated. He was certainly angry. I heard raised voices on more than one occasion. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And this Mr. Faversham, what is his profession? A financier of sorts, though I confess his reputation is not of the most reputable kind. Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Such men are often the most ingenious, said he. Lestrade stepped forward. If this fellow had a quarrel with the deceased, why did he not simply confront him openly? Why resort to such elaborate methods? Holmes turned to him. Because, my dear Lestrade, a direct confrontation leaves traces, witnesses, motives, opportunities, but a death that explains itself requires none. He glanced once more about the room, as though fixing its every detail in his mind. Come, said he, we must pay a visit to Mr. Faversham. It was nearing evening when we arrived at the address Sir Reginald had provided, a tall, narrow house in a less distinguished quarter of the city. The street was quieter here, with the lamps already lit against the encroaching dusk. A servant admitted us after a brief delay, and we were shown into a room furnished with a curious mixture of taste and ostentation. Its occupant rose as we entered. Julian Faversham was a man of about 40, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to measure rather than observe. His manner was composed, but there was about him an alertness that suggested a mind perpetually on guard. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he, with a slight inclination of the head. "I had not expected such distinguished company." Holmes returned the bow with equal politeness. "Nor I, Mr. Faversham, such readiness to receive it." Faversham's lips curved faintly. "I assume this visit concerns the unfortunate death of Mr. Edward Markham." "It does." "A tragic affair," said Faversham, "though from what I hear—"
A simple one. Holmes's gaze rested upon him. "Simple things," said he, "often bear closer examination." Faversham gestured toward the chairs. "Pray be seated." We did so, Holmes taking a position from which he could observe both the man and the room with equal ease. "You were acquainted with Mr. Markham?" Holmes began. "I was." "And recently in disagreement with him?" Faversham did not deny it. "There were differences," said he, "nothing unusual in business." "Yet you were heard to argue with him?" "That is not uncommon either." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "When did you last see him?" Faversham paused just for a fraction of a second. "The day before yesterday." Holmes's eyes did not leave his face. "Not yesterday evening?" "No." "Nor did you send him any communication?" Faversham's expression remained composed. No." Holmes nodded slowly. "Curious," said he. "In what way?" "Because Mr. Markham received a letter shortly before his death, one which provoked a strong reaction." Faversham's gaze sharpened slightly. "Did he?" "He did." "And you suppose it came from me?" "I suppose nothing," Holmes replied. "I observe." There was a brief silence. Then Faversham smiled. "You have a reputation, Mr. Holmes, for seeing much where others see little." "And for seeing little," Holmes returned quietly, "where others see too much." Faversham regarded him for a moment, then gave a soft laugh. "A fair exchange." Holmes rose. "I shall not detain you further, at present." Faversham inclined his head once more. "I trust you will find what you seek." Holmes paused at the door. "Oh, I think I already have," said he. We stepped out once more into the evening air.
And I turned at once to Holmes. "Well?" I asked. Holmes walked a few paces in silence before replying. "He lies," said he simply. "You are certain?" "Entirely." "In what respect?" Holmes glanced back toward the house. "He knew of the letter before I mentioned its contents. His reaction was too immediate, too controlled." "And you believe he sent it?" "I do." "But that proves only that he had contact with Markham, not that he committed the murder." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "True, but it establishes connection, and where there is connection, there is often opportunity." He stopped beneath a street lamp and turned to me. "Did you observe his hands?" "His hands?" I repeated. "Yes. I cannot say that I did." Holmes smiled faintly. "They were unmarked, immaculately so, yet his cuffs bore the faintest trace of discoloration, something metallic, perhaps. And that signifies that he has handled something recently, something not part of his ordinary environment." Holmes resumed walking. "And there is more," he added. "His room, the arrangement of objects upon his desk, suggests a man with mechanical interests, small instruments, precision tools." A man capable of constructing such a device as you described? Holmes inclined his head. Capable, and perhaps inclined? I felt a growing certainty that we were drawing nearer to the heart of the matter. And what now? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. Now, said he, we give Mr. Faversham the opportunity to complete his work. Complete it? Holmes's voice was very quiet. What a man who commits so intricate a crime rarely does so without securing its outcome. And you think he has not yet done so? Holmes stopped. I think, said he, that there is still something he must recover or confirm. And we shall allow him to do it? Holmes's smile was thin. No, Watson, said he, we shall be waiting when he tries. As we turned back toward the direction of Kensington, I could not help but feel that the case had entered its most dangerous phase. The unseen hand which had orchestrated so perfect a deception was now at last within reach. And Holmes, with that calm certainty which never failed him at the crucial moment, was preparing to draw it into the light. Holmes insisted that we return at once to the Markham residence, and though the hour was growing late, Sir Reginald admitted us without hesitation. But there was now an air of suppressed expectation within the house, as though its very walls had begun to sense that the matter, so recently declared finished, was far from concluded. Lestrade, too, had joined us again, though with a manner that suggested equal parts scepticism and reluctant anticipation. You expect him to come here? The inspector asked, as we stood once more in the shadowed study. I do, said Holmes quietly. And for what purpose? Holmes glanced toward the desk. To recover what he believes remains, said he. The letter? I suggested. Or some fragment of it. Or perhaps... His gaze shifted briefly to the hearth. Something more essential. He moved about the room with deliberate care, making several small adjustments whose purpose I did not at first comprehend. The chair was set again in its earlier position. The desk was left as we had found it. Even the curtains were drawn to the same degree as before. You are recreating the scene, I said. As nearly as possible, Holmes replied. A man returning to a place expects to find it unchanged. Any deviation may warn him. And where are we to conceal ourselves? Asked Lestrade. Holmes indicated the adjoining room. There. The door may be left slightly ajar. We shall have both sight and hearing. Sir Reginald looked uneasy. You are certain he will come? Holmes met his gaze steadily. A man who has gone to such lengths, said he, does not leave his work incomplete. There was no more to be said. We withdrew to the adjoining room, leaving the study in darkness, save for the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. Time passed slowly. The house grew still. The distant sounds of the city faded into a low, indistinct murmur. Within our concealed position, no one spoke. Holmes stood nearest the door, his figure motionless, his attention wholly fixed. I confess that my own nerves were not so steady. The silence pressed upon me, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house or the soft ticking of a clock somewhere beyond our hearing. Then at last, a sound. Faint but unmistakable. The soft click of a latch. Holmes's hand rose slightly, signaling absolute stillness. The study door opened. A figure entered, quietly, cautiously. For a moment he stood within the threshold, listening. Then he closed the door behind him with careful precision. Even in the dim light I recognized him. Julian Faversham. He moved at once toward the desk, his steps swift but controlled. And there was no hesitation in his manner now, no trace of the composed host we had encountered earlier. Instead, there was urgency, purpose. He expected this, I whispered. Holmes did not reply. Faversham reached the desk and began to search. Quickly, methodically, his hands moved over the surface, opening drawers, shifting papers, pausing only for an instant at the blotting pad. Then he turned toward the hearth. There, for the first time, he hesitated, his gaze fixed upon the fender, and I saw a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or unease, pass across his face. He knelt. His hand moved along the edge where Holmes had earlier found the fragment of wire. And then, very carefully, he reached into the ash. Holmes's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I should advise you to leave that where it is, mister."
Faversham. The man started violently, his hand freezing mid-motion. For a fraction of a second he remained crouched, as though unable to comprehend that he had been anticipated. Then he rose slowly and turned. Holmes stepped into the room, followed by myself and Lestrade. Faversham's expression hardened at once. "So," said he, "you have been expecting me?" "From the moment you denied sending the letter," Holmes replied. Faversham gave a short, sharp laugh. "And what do you suppose you have found?" Holmes's gaze was unwavering. "The truth," said he. Lestrade stepped forward. "I think you had better explain yourself, sir," he said. Faversham's eyes flicked from one to the other of us. "Explain? On what grounds?" Holmes moved toward the hearth and bent, retrieving from the ash the small object Faversham had sought. "This," said he.
What, he held it up, a twisted remnant of fine wire, scarcely visible in the dim light. "A fragment of your device." Faversham's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You have an active imagination, Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I have a very practical one." He straightened. "You sent Mr. Markham a letter, one which contained not only words but a concealed mechanism. When opened, it released a vapour, sufficient to weaken and disorient him." Faversham said nothing. "Under its influence," Holmes continued, "he was compelled to write the confession which you desired. The tone of that document differs markedly from the earlier words impressed upon the blotting pad, a distinction which you overlooked." Lestrade glanced sharply at Holmes, then at Faversham. "And the shot?" he demanded. Holmes's voice was calm. "The final act was accomplished by means of a secondary mechanism, one which discharged the revolver without the conscious action of the victim. The uneven powder marks bear witness to this." Faversham's lips tightened slightly. "And the locked door?" Lestrade pressed. Holmes smiled faintly. "The beauty of the arrangement lies precisely there. The device was introduced by the letter. The act was completed within the room. No entry or exit was required." There was a long silence. Then Faversham spoke. "And you believe you can prove this?" Holmes held up the fragment once more. "You returned for this," said he. "You could not risk its discovery. That alone is proof enough of its significance." Faversham's composure faltered, just for an instant. Holmes took a step closer. "Or you quarrelled with Markham over certain securities, documents which he refused to release. You devised a method to remove him without suspicion and to recover what you sought." Faversham's eyes flickered. "The letter," Holmes continued, "was both the instrument and the key, but you made one error." "And that is?" Faversham asked, his voice now very quiet. Holmes's gaze was steady. "You assumed that certainty would go unquestioned." There was a moment, a single, suspended instant, during which the entire weight of the case seemed to rest. Then Lestrade stepped forward. "I think that will do, Mr. Faversham," said he. "You will come with me." For a heartbeat, I thought the man might attempt escape. His posture shifted slightly, his eyes darting toward the door. But Holmes was already there. Faversham's shoulders sagged, and with that, it had the illusion, The perfect, unquestioned certainty of Edward Markham's death began at last to collapse beneath the weight of truth. For several moments after Lestrade's declaration, no one moved. The silence within the study, once so heavy with concealment, now seemed charged with the unmistakable tension of exposure. Faversham stood very still, his eyes fixed upon Holmes, as though measuring, perhaps for the last time, the strength of the intellect that had undone him. "You are an extraordinary man, Mr. Holmes," he said at length. Holmes inclined his head slightly, neither accepting nor rejecting the compliment. "And yet," Faversham continued, "you have constructed your case upon inference. Ingenious, certainly, but inference nonetheless." Lestrade gave a short, impatient exclamation. "We have more than enough to proceed," said he. You were found tampering with evidence in a house where a man has died under suspicious circumstances." Faversham's lips curved faintly. "Suspicious? Only because Mr. Holmes insists upon it." Holmes spoke then, his voice quiet but precise. "No, Mr. Faversham. Suspicion arose the moment the facts failed to agree with the conclusion. I have merely followed them to their natural end." Faversham's gaze sharpened. "And what precisely is that end?" Holmes stepped forward, holding the fragment of wire between his fingers. "The reconstruction of your method," said he. "A method which, though cleverly conceived, was not beyond detection." He turned slightly, as though addressing both Faversham and Lestrade alike. "You required 3 things. First, a means of incapacitating your victim without entering the room. Second, a means of compelling him to write the confession. And third, a method of producing the appearance of self-inflicted death." Faversham's expression remained composed, but I observed that his hands had clenched ever so slightly. "The letter," Holmes continued, "served as your point of entry. Concealed within it, or attached to it, was a small mechanical apparatus, delicate enough to escape notice, yet sufficient to release a vapour when exposed to warmth." "A conjecture," Faversham murmured. Holmes ignored the interruption. "The hearth provided the necessary heat. The fragment of wire we have recovered is consistent with a spring mechanism, one designed to activate after a brief delay. Once triggered, it would release its contents into the confined space of the room." He turned to me briefly. "Watson has already confirmed that such vapours may act rapidly upon the nervous system, producing confusion, weakness, and a heightened suggestibility." Faversham's eyes flickered. "Under such influence," Holmes went on, "Mr. Markham was no longer in full command of his faculties. The agitation observed by the servants corresponds to the initial effect of the letter. The subsequent calmness of the confession reflects the diminished resistance that followed." Lestrade nodded slowly, now fully absorbed. "And the revolver?" he asked. Holmes raised his hand slightly. "The final element," said he, "was the most ingenious and the most flawed." He crossed to the desk and rested his fingers upon its surface. "The weapon was placed in Mr. Markham's hand, but not fired by it. A secondary device, likely attached or applied during the same process, ensured that the shot was discharged at the appropriate moment." "That is absurd," Faversham said sharply. "No such mechanism could—" Holmes's voice cut across his. "The powder marks upon the hand are insufficient. The distribution is uneven. The position of the chair indicates movement inconsistent with a voluntary act. These are not speculations, Mr. Faversham. They are observations." There was a pause. "And the locked door?" Lestrade pressed. Holmes turned. "An essential part of the illusion," said he. "The victim himself secured it before the final stages of the process took effect. Thus, when the shot was heard and the door forced, all appeared as it should, save for the details that betrayed the truth." Faversham's composure faltered at last. "And you suppose," he said slowly, "that I constructed such a device, delivered it undetected, and removed all trace of it save for that fragment?" Holmes' eyes were steady. "You returned for it," said he. "That was your mistake. You could not risk its discovery." Faversham said nothing. Holmes took one step closer. "You misjudged one thing, Mr. Faversham. You relied upon certainty, the certainty that a man found alone, with a confession in his hand and a weapon at his side, would never be questioned." Faversham's gaze dropped just for an instant. "And yet," Holmes added softly, "you overlooked the one element that no arrangement can wholly control, the truth of the physical evidence." There was a long silence. Then, with a slow exhalation, Faversham's shoulders sank slightly as though some internal resistance had at last given way. "You are correct in one respect," he said quietly. "Certainty is a powerful ally." He looked up again, and there was now something almost weary in his expression. "I believed it would suffice." Lestrade stepped forward at once. "I think that is quite enough," said he. "You will come with me." Faversham did not resist. As he was led from the room, he paused briefly at the threshold and glanced back, not at Lestrade, nor at Sir Reginald, but at Holmes. "A remarkable construction," he said. "You have undone it very neatly." Holmes inclined his head once more. "It was not the construction that failed," said he. "It was the assumption." Faversham gave a faint, rueful smile. "Yes," he said, "I see that now." And with that, he was gone. The study seemed strangely altered in his absence. The same objects remained, not the same arrangement of furniture, but the oppressive certainty that had once filled the room had lifted, replaced by a quieter, more honest stillness. Sir Reginald stood near the desk, his expression one of profound relief mingled with lingering disbelief. "I cannot adequately express my gratitude, Mr. Holmes," said he. "To think that Edward—" Holmes raised a hand gently. "Your brother's instincts were sound," said he. He resisted to the last. Sir Reginald bowed his head. Lestrade returned shortly thereafter, his manner now entirely changed. "I shall see that the necessary arrangements are made," said he. "And I will admit, Mr. Holmes, you were right to question it." Holmes smiled faintly. "I usually am," said he. Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Yes," said he, "so you are." It was some hours later, although as we sat once more in the familiar comfort of Baker Street, that I reflected upon the case in its entirety. "It is a curious thing," I said, "that a crime so elaborate should depend upon something so simple as a letter." Holmes, who was seated by the fire, regarded the flames thoughtfully. "Not so curious, Watson," said he. "The simplest objects often afford the greatest opportunities, particularly when they are trusted without question." "And the method?" I asked. "Do you believe it will ever be fully understood?" Holmes gave a slight shrug. "In all essential respects, it already is. The details may interest the scientist, but the principle is clear." He leaned back, his long fingers once more steepled. "A man sought to construct a crime so complete that it would require no investigation. He succeeded, almost." "Almost," I echoed. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the firelight. "The difficulty," said he, "is that the truth has a way of asserting itself, even when every effort is made to silence it." He fell silent then, and I did not disturb him. For my own part, I could not help but marvel once more at the singular faculty by which my friend could penetrate even the most perfect illusion. And as I set down these notes, I am reminded that in this case, perhaps more than in any other, it was not the presence of mystery that challenged him, but its complete and calculated absence. It was on the following morning, as the pale light of day filtered through the curtains of Baker Street, that Holmes, having passed the night in quiet contemplation rather than sleep, at last chose to set the final piece of the matter in its proper place. I found him seated at the table, in the recovered fragment of wire before him, alongside a small arrangement of instruments and papers. His expression bore that rare quality of complete satisfaction, not of pride, but of intellectual resolution. "You have not rested," said I. "I have rested sufficiently," he replied. "The mind, Watson, requires less sleep when it has achieved coherence." "And the case?" I asked. "Is there anything yet unresolved?" Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite him. "On the contrary," said he, "it is now entirely resolved. What remains is merely the articulation of its logic." I seated myself, notebook in hand, for I knew that such moments were not to be wasted. "You will recall," Holmes began, "that from the outset the case presented itself not as a mystery but as a conclusion, suicide complete in every visible respect." "Yes," said I, and yet there were discrepancies, small but decisive. The powder marks, the position of the chair, the missing letter, the overheard words, each in isolation might be dismissed. Together they formed a contradiction. He took up the fragment of wire. "This," he said, "was the key to the method, not the whole of it, but enough to indicate that a mechanical agency had been employed." "And the vapor?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "A means of weakening the victim without direct contact, subtle, effective, and, most importantly, untraceable under ordinary examination." He leaned back slightly. "But the true brilliance of the crime lay not in the device itself, but in its design of inevitability. Every element was arranged to produce a single, unquestionable interpretation." "Suicide," I said again. "Precisely. The letter provoked agitation, or the confession provided motive. The locked room eliminated intrusion. The weapon supplied the means. Each piece reinforced the others." Holmes's eyes sharpened. It was not merely a crime, it was a narrative. I could not help but admire the clarity with which he expressed it. "And yet," I said, "the narrative failed." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "Because it was too complete. It left no room for inquiry, and thus invited it." He rose and moved toward the window, looking out upon the waking street. "Faversham's error," he continued, "was not in his construction, but in his assumption that certainty would prevent scrutiny. He believed that if every question were answered in advance, none would be asked." "And instead," I said, "it was the very completeness that aroused suspicion." "Just so." There was a brief silence. "And the motive?" I asked. "The securities?" Holmes turned back. "Recovered," said he. "Lestrade informed me this morning that certain documents were found among Faversham's effects, documents which Markham had refused to release. Their value was considerable. And thus the motive is established entirely." Holmes returned to his seat. "There is, however," he added, "one further point of interest." "Oh?" "The phrase overheard by the servants, 'You shall not have it.' It was, in fact, the most direct clue of all." "In what way?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "It told us that the victim was resisting, not despairing. A man intent upon self-destruction does not argue possession. He relinquishes." I nodded slowly. "And the second voice?" I asked. "Or the lack of it?" Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "There was no second voice," said he, "or only the echo of the letter's contents. The servants, hearing agitation, assumed dialogue. It was a natural error. And yet it misled the investigation." "Indeed?" Holmes leaned back, his expression now one of quiet reflection. "It is often the case, Watson, that what we believe we hear is shaped as much by expectation as by fact. I closed my notebook. "And what of Faversham?" I asked. "Will he confess?" Holmes gave a slight shrug. "Whether he does or not is of little consequence. The evidence, combined with his actions, is sufficient. The law will take its course." He rose once more and moved toward the mantel, taking up his pipe at last. "And thus," said he, "the matter concludes." I regarded him thoughtfully. "It is a remarkable case," I said. "Yea, one in which the absence of mystery proved the greatest mystery of all." Holmes smiled faintly as he struck a match. "A paradox," said he, "but a useful one." He lit his pipe and drew upon it, the smoke curling upward in slow, thoughtful spirals. "There will always be those," he continued, "who seek to construct perfection, whether in crime or in life. They imagine that if every detail is accounted for, they may escape consequence. And they are mistaken." Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "They are mistaken in one essential respect." "And that is?" Holmes turned his keen gaze upon me. "They forget," said he quietly, "that truth is not a thing to be constructed, but a thing to be discovered." He settled back into his chair, the case already receding into the recesses of his remarkable mind. "For my own part," he added, "I find imperfection far more interesting." And with that, the matter of Edward Markham's death, so carefully arranged to leave no question behind, came to its final and fitting close, resolved not by chance nor by conjecture, but by that relentless logic which in the hands of Sherlock Holmes could illuminate even the most perfect illusion.